Nvidia stock just ripped 24% higher in one day. In this video, I'm going to share 3 key points. The first is on their earnings that drove this stock price surge. The second key point is I'm going to share the news about one trader that made well over $100 million just in the last 6 months buying Nvidia stock, what he did and what he looks for. And then the third is my thoughts on where does Nvidia go from here. I'm doubling down on some words of caution. So this is very relevant if you are an Nvidia shareholder in terms of where can it go from here, things you definitely want to consider. So as we look at Nvidia's share results, looking at their earnings results, you see in the first quarter 2020, it's the first quarter calendar 2023, first quarter their fiscal year 2024, their results were down 13%, and their profit margins, their gross margins, were down once again year over year. So looking at soft results when you're looking at their actual results during the first quarter, but really that doesn't matter because their outlook is just so incredible. Where previously I was just showing you $7.2 billion in revenue in their most recent year, in the most recent quarter, and now they're guiding to $11 billion. This blew away expectations. This goes from a 13% decline year over year to 64% growth year over year with expanding profit margins. So why are they forecasting this really strong growth? Well, it all comes down to AI. They talk about generative AI is driving exponential growth in compute requirements and a fast transition to NVIDIA's accelerated computing, which is the most versatile, most energy efficient, and lowest total cost of ownership approach to train and deploy AI. So folks, this has been something that has been, sort of telegraphed, that people have gotten excited about. And it's that if you want to develop the latest and cutting edge large language models that you've seen with OpenAI's ChatGPT, the lowest cost solution for doing that in terms of the hardware is NVIDIA's products. That's what they're clearly saying, and that's what their results show with this surge in demand for the quarter ahead. And it's not just one given company, it's cloud service providers or the CSPs. So when they talk about cloud service providers, they're talking about, the hyperscalers like Google, like Amazon, like Microsoft, the ones that have this incredible cloud infrastructure. So they're saying, hey, we need to spend a lot more because there's this incredible AI demand. But they're also seeing it from consumer internet companies. So this might be a company like Shopify. This might be a company like Meta. And then they're also seeing it from enterprises. So they're seeing this huge surge in interest across all types of different businesses, because not only do you have the core infrastructure providers saying, hey, we need to have this, but you have companies saying, hey, we have all this proprietary data, we're going to need to train it and build a new AI model. So this is striking a lot of investors as very obvious and exceptional growth in the years ahead for Nvidia. And they talk about how this demand has extended our data center visibility out a few quarters. And this is typically the challenge with Nvidia, is that it's tough to say, okay, well, what does your growth rate look like? And that was honestly my challenge when I called it out a few weeks ago. Is previously they were guiding to a decline, and now they're forecasting a 64% growth, clearly better than they expected, clearly better than a lot of Wall Street analysts expected. And so this is a huge development. This is a huge improvement in their fundamentals to be able to say, hey, we weren't really sure what our outlook is, but now we have to ramp up substantially higher supply for the second half of the year, and they procured it because they're seeing such strong demand. So that should translate into even improved sales versus what they're guiding to for the second quarter. So of course this gets Wall Street super excited, looking at this huge sort of inflection going from a decline of 13% year over year to 64% growth. You don't see this often with businesses, and that's part of the reason why Nvidia, even though it's a nearly $1 trillion company, it's jumping so much in one day, is because you don't see this type of revolutionary change in terms of reacceleration in terms of growth. And AI is clearly driving it. One investor, one trader who made I'm estimating $175 million just in the last few months on Nvidia is Stanley Druckenmiller. And I think this is super important for investors to reflect on, especially as everyone has their own different journeys. So Stanley Druckenmiller's approach is that he's looking, and keep in mind, it's very different than someone like Warren Buffett. And I try to think more of the Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger mindset of investing. What Stanley Druckenmiller is doing is he goes, I just want to know what I think is highly certain in 6 months from now or 18 months from now that the market isn't yet pricing in. And so he rightfully called this out, and he, you could see it. This is whale wisdom. His family office is Duquesne. He even did an interview where he mentioned, his optimism for Nvidia, and he compounded at 30% plus for 30 years without a single down year. So he's a multi-billionaire. And so his approach is to find these things that are just so obvious in the short term, in the next, let's say 1 year to 1.5, under 2 years, that he thinks is going to play out, and leaning into that, where he also wants to see a favorable stock price. And even if the valuation is rich, he often, goes, well, wait a second, that valuation is backward looking. You need to be thinking forward looking. And sometimes this price capturing data that's not yet reflected, in the fundamentals. And so he, that's his game, is he looks for these things where even if it's, might be expensive, which it was, recently, but clearly their fundamentals did even better than a lot of folks expected. And that's an important data point for a lot of investors to consider, is that generally with an expensive stock, like 8 out of 10 times, it's not going to work out over time. When you buy something that's at a nosebleed valuation, 8 out of 10 times it goes against you. But, maybe 2 out of 10 times you have an instance where it's just so surprisingly, positive outlook, such a surprising development with fundamentals that, you get rewarded with further momentum. And in this instance, I think he nailed it. He saw what was going on with AI, and I got to give him a lot of credit, because even though it was very obvious to me as well that AI is this revolutionary thing, I didn't realize the extent of the demand that Nvidia would see and the inflection in terms of their fundamentals, in terms of their profits that you would look at in the upcoming quarter and potentially, the next year or two. And so that's a big deal. And that's how he saw that in the fourth quarter of 2022, when he started buying at what looks like to be $160 a share. So he's made, and he bought around 800,000 shares. He made a cool $175 million profit off of this. Once again, that's very different than Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, where they're saying, what is certain 5 years from now, 10 years from now? I don't necessarily know what's going to happen, in the next 6 months to a year, but I want to find things that I'm very certain 5 to 10 years from now. So this is the difference between a trader and an investor mentality. And I want to be able to buy at a really cheap multiple to what I think will very likely happen in that long-term time frame, in that 5-10 years out. And so I think Druckenmiller, he goes, well, it can be rich. The valuation can be rich now, but it might get even crazy. It might get really exciting because their fundamentals are going to really surprise folks. And so that's how he's done really well in his career. You won't see Warren Buffett buy something like Nvidia here, because he's looking for something where he's saying, in 5 years from now, can I underwrite this as a really cheap valuation? And you can't with Nvidia. And I'm going to talk about that with my sort of doubling down on my thoughts with Nvidia. The question is, where does Nvidia go from here? First of all, I just started buying more of a stock that I think has over 300% upside that I called out to my subscribers at unrivaledinvesting.com. I also expect to raise prices soon. So now's the time to act if you'd like to lock in a favorable rate and take charge of your investment journey. In full disclosure, this is not financial advice. So a couple of points, as I, double down and share my thoughts on Nvidia from here. First of all, it's really interesting to see, around the same time, the founder of Nvidia having an interview with Financial Times warning about the risk of unfavorable trade relations, how it's posing enormous damage to U.S. tech. particularly how Nvidia's hands are tied behind our back with their inability to sell the most advanced chips to one of the company's biggest markets, talking about how U.S. regulations are limiting and severely impacting Nvidia's ability to sell the most cutting-edge semiconductors to the Chinese market. And he added this point that I think is really interesting and I don't think is fully priced in. And this sort of gets to the point of, Druckenmiller versus Buffett, is that Druckenmiller, he's focused on, well, right now there's going to be this surge in AI that far exceeds, what a lot of people were expecting. He nailed that. He absolutely nailed the profit and sales. But that long-term picture, and it wouldn't surprise me to see Druckenmiller cut his position because he's a trader, because he's going to start saying, well, wait a second, what's going to be priced in 18 months from now? So he nailed it in December, where he's thinking, okay, in the next 6 months, in the next 18 months, you're going to see this inflection. But in 18 months again, could you start seeing another dynamic? In 24 months, could you start seeing another dynamic? And then you start getting the long-term investor mentality of, hey, how certain are you of their results 5 to 10 years from now? And here it is, when you have the founder of Nvidia warning investors like, look, Chinese companies are starting to build their own chips to rival Nvidia's market-leading processors. So that was the Financial Times commentary. And he said, this is his direct quote, if China can't buy from the United States, they'll just build it themselves. So the U.S. has to be careful. China is a very important market for the technology industry. So this does suggest potential increased competition for Nvidia in the years ahead if the trade relations with China continue to be unfavorable, where not only Nvidia won't be able to sell to China, but China could do their best to come up with a competitive offering. Now, I think it's too early to say like, hey, this is going to impact the results, but that's the uncertainty that you have, let's say 5 years from now or 10 years from now when you're thinking about this business. Now, a lot of people might say like, look, this really doesn't matter. This isn't just about the hardware, but it's also about the software that Nvidia, works with, where, it's building this ecosystem of developers that say, hey, we are only going to use, these core products. And this is part of the reason why Nvidia has done so well in this marketplace. This is where I'm doubling down on my words of caution to investors. Could it work out, from here? Absolutely. But I think it's important to have some caution. And when I look at the high side, now the stock's around $950 billion market cap. It is higher than where I last called it out, largely because their fundamentals, their outlook is just so much better than what I expected, and honestly, most investors. So I got that wrong. I'm definitely calling that out. But I'm doubling down the caution that investors should consider, particularly long holders, because whenever you have something like this where stock price surges, you have to ask yourself, well, what's the growth rate that I'm expecting? What's the margins that I'm expecting? What's the N multiple that I'm expecting to deliver an attractive return? And what I'm saying is, in a high case scenario, and keep in mind, this is hypothetical, of course, Nvidia stock can go way higher, way lower. What I'm saying is they have to deliver at least 35% annualized growth on top of 60% growth this year, 40% profit margins, and a 30 times N multiple 5 years from now, just to get around a 60% return over the next 5 years. So if you are not 100% certain that they can compound at 35%, growing from $40 billion in revenue potentially this year. Keep in mind, last year they're at closer to $27 billion. So growing from $40 billion to $140 billion over the next 5 years. If you are not certain about that, this is sort of like a warning. This is a cautionary, comment that they need to have. And this is the challenge when you have a stock price run up so much, is you need to be really certain that that growth rate will be there in order to have an attractive return. And I personally think this is where I personally align myself more with, the Warren Buffett mindset of, I'd rather get something where I'm highly, I think the outcome 5 years from now is very likely. And I think the outcome for Nvidia is very likely that they're bigger. I just don't know if it's 35% annualized growth, or if it's going to be 25%, or if it's going to be 30%, because those different changes, just the small change between 30 and 35% and a small change in, N multiple 5 years from now of 25 times, and a slightly lower profit margin, effectively means you break even over 5 years. And so, how certain are you on 35% versus 30%? That's really what it comes down to, versus the value investor mindset of, hey, I'm not getting any sort of credit for valuation potential expansion. I'm buying maybe at this low multiple, and I think the growth is very likely. So, everyone has to have their own journey. Druckenmiller doesn't do it Buffett style, and it's worked out well for him. If you can, well anticipate things that will happen 6 months from now or 12 months from now, you too might be a wonderful trader like Druckenmiller. That's just not my journey. That's just not my game. If this video has been helpful for you, please make a point of hitting that thumbs up, hit that subscribe button. Thanks so much for watching Unrivaled Investing.